Hey, guys. Tonight we're riding into the dusty, creaky, and slightly smelly world of cowboy survival. Picture this. You're out on the open range, the sun's not even fully up, and already your back hurts, your coffee tastes like charred regret, and your horse looks more awake than you do. The saddle's cold, your boots are still wet from last night's rain, and that buzzing in your ear? Probably just a mosquito the size of a walnut. You're about to spend weeks, maybe months, on a trail where your only comforts are a worn blanket, a reluctant horse. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Very creative rule bending, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. A fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Watching from and what time it is locally. I'm always curious who's out there, wide awake with me in these twilight hours. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft, and hey, post your location and local time down in the comments. I love seeing how far this sleepy little you sling one leg over the saddle just as the orange-pink horizon begins to yawn. The airs you're riding herd today. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of cattle need to be driven from one end of nowhere to the other. The trail isn't a road, it's a suggestion. You're riding over cracked earth, across low scrublands, where thorny mesquite claws at your chaps. Sometimes you ford shallow rivers. Sometimes you cross terrain that looks suspiciously like the moon, but somehow dustier. Baptism under the wrong spelling of your name. Good enough. The bit you ride long. 10, 12, even 14 hours in the saddle some days. Breaks are short. You might hop down to relieve yourself behind a bush, swat at biting flies, or check your gear. But the cattle don't wait, and neither does the sun. If you're lucky, your backside just feels like wood. If you're not, it feels like someone sandpapered it with cactus. Cowboys didn't travel alone. Usually, a group rode together, 6 to 10 cowboys, 1 or 2 wranglers, a trail boss, and the cook, who trundled along behind in a chuck wagon that creaked and groaned like it resented every rock in the trail. The cook had the toughest job of all, feeding you with beans, bacon, and hope. A standard day starts at around 4 a.m. You wake up, if you slept at all, to a metal triangle being rung like it owes someone money. The stars are still out. You grope for your boots, shake out any scorpions, and splash your face with water that's slightly colder than betrayal. Then you eat, if there's food. More on that in the next section. Tiny rune threads baked into wood and hidden in fences. Once you're mounted, the day's rhythm sets in. Push the cattle forward. Watch for strays. Keep a wary eye on weather and terrain. If it starts raining, everything turns to mud. If it gets too hot, cows start collapsing, and you start hallucinating water fountains. Coyotes trail in the distance. Quirky bit of trail trivia. Cowboys sometimes sang to their cattle at night. Soft, rhythmic songs. Anything from old folk tunes to nonsense syllables. Why? Because cows are weirdly comforted by lullabies. And a calm herd is a quiet herd. And a quiet herd doesn't stampede. Usually. Though one unlucky cowboy reportedly tried singing opera once, and historians still argue whether the cowboy accent we think of today, the slow drawl, the nasal twang, was ever real or just a Hollywood invention. Records are murky, and regional dialects from Texas to Wyoming were wildly different. What is certain, though, is that communication on the trail was minimal and usually shouted over cattle farts and creaking leather. Dozens, then hundreds, all you don't just ride straight either. Cattle wander. You might zigzag for hours just to keep a group from heading in the wrong direction. At night, you take turns riding perimeter, guarding against rustlers, coyotes, and sleepy cows with wanderlust. You get in Viking society. This simple habit of marking wood became its own language. And, like most things the Vikings touched, it was both brutally practical and strangely poetic. Their world didn't offer many second chances, but it did offer the chance to make your mark dot literally. The horses are your lifeline. Lose your horse, and you're walking back across the Texas Panhandle in boots made for posing, not hiking. Every cowboy had a string. Multiple horses rotated throughout the drive, but even so, they get tired, sore, stubborn. Some even bite. Dust Bucket has a particular fondness for pretending he's injured, until there's food. Birds. Familiar ones. Ones that catch your attention. It's a message, a short note, but it reads like a smile. That's when you realize this isn't a ledger or warning stick. It's a flirtation. By sundown, the landscape turns golden, and everything slows. You circle the herd, settle them down, and hobble your horse near camp. You shovel a plate of lukewarm food into your mouth while trying to avoid the cook's wrath. Then you roll out a blanket. Maybe under a tree, maybe under open. You wake up with something crawling on your face. It might be a beetle. It might be a piece of last night's dinner trying to stage a comeback. Either way, your day is off to a fine start. The first real thought in your head, after "what just bit me," is food, or at least whatever counts as food out here. Spoiler, it's not. The cowboy menu is limited. This morning, the cook, let's call him Cookie, because nearly every chuckwagon cook was called that, is ladling out what might be coffee, might also be crankcase oil. You sip it anyway. It's hot, it's bitter, and it could probably dissolve a nail. Still, it gets the job done. Sort of. Found that one. Breakfast usually includes beans, biscuits, and maybe bacon if the meat hasn't gone green yet. It's not the crispy kind either. More like a slab of salt and fat that's been reanimated with heat. You gnaw at it thoughtfully, while watching someone else try to convince their teeth to break into a biscuit that's harder than most gravestones. White resting. This is the scene behind the exploding coffins of Barbados in the 18th century. The church bell rings before the sun even thinks about rising. You stir in your pile of straw, muscles stiff from yesterday's labor and tomorrow's dread. The rooster hasn't crowed yet, but Brother Alric's bell clangs through the fog like a divine alarm clock, reminding you that your day doesn't begin when you say, it begins when he says. Historians still argue whether that was tradition or just one very committed fashion. Lunch is usually skipped. You ride with a piece of jerky tucked into your saddlebag. Not the tasty kind you might buy at a gas station today either. This is trail-made jerky. So salty it could resurrect ancient Roman fish sauce. You tear at it with your teeth, hoping it doesn't break a molar. sometimes you get a hunk of hardtack. A flour and water biscuit so dense you wonder if it's meant to be eaten. Dinner, that's the main event. If cookies had time and the herd behaved, you might get something more elaborate. Elaborate, in this case, means stew. Don't get excited. It's water, beans, and maybe the last of the bacon chunks if no one stole them for lunch. Sometimes dried apples show up, rehydrated into a sweetish mush. You eat every bite, though. Hunger doesn't leave much room for criticism. A time bomb of unpleasantness. And let's not forget the flour. Cowboys practically survived on flour. Biscuits, flapjacks, even glue-like gravy that sat in your gut like regret. They stored flour in huge sacks, and when that ran low, it was a bad day. One trail story goes that a cook ran out of flour mid-drive and started making coffee soup, hot water, coffee grounds, and leftover lard. Surprisingly, no one died. You eat all this using a tin plate and a spoon that's also your only weapon against whatever just tried to crawl into your beans. You wash it down with more of Cookie's coffee, now tasting like ashes and a little hope. And then sometimes you get dessert. Accidents? Maybe. But no one's willing to test divine. Yes, dessert. Rare, but glorious. Maybe a slice of dried apple pie, usually made from canned fruit and a crust more symbolic than edible. Sometimes molasses cookies if sugar was available, but mostly dessert is a second helping of beans. Again, theological seafood loophole. But you are grateful because Brother Tillman occasionally trades salted beaver tail. One quirky cowboy hack? Toasting hardtack over the fire until it's just soft enough to not crack a tooth, then slathering it with bacon grease like some grim version of country toast. It actually helps, though calling it delicious would be an insult to actual food everywhere. No questions. You probably think, why not just hunt? Rabbits, deer, anything. And sometimes, yes. Cowboys shot wild game when they could, but most of the time they didn't have the luxury to hunt. Herds needed tending, and rifles were for predators or rustlers, not chasing rabbits through the brush. Plus, without refrigeration, meat spoiled fast. You could kill a deer at noon and have soup by still, once in a while, a chuck wagon miracle happened. A nearby ranch gifted smoked beef. A lucky shot brought in wild turkey. Or someone found eggs, though whether those were chicken or snake eggs was often an open question. Cookie once cracked one open, screamed, and never tried it. Water, by the way, was its own gamble. Clear springs were rare, and even then, not always clean. You learn to boil it, filter it with cloth, or just cross your fingers and sip fast. One cowboy wrote that he once drank from a puddle blessed by a longhorn's backside, and survived. He later became the food wasn't just fuel, it was morale. Bad food made for grumpy riders, lazy herding, and fist fights over whose turn it was to scrape the pot. Some trail bosses paid extra for good cooks, knowing that half the battle of keeping cowboys moving was keeping them fed with something that didn't inspire mutiny. Very robust this week. There's even speculation that hair was oiled to prevent heat loss, similar to those grease layers we talked about earlier. Still, most nights, you're full enough. Not satisfied, not smiling, but full. You clean your plate with a scrap of bread or a dirty bandana. Rinse your tin cup with ash and spit. Yes, really. And thank Cookie with a grunt. He grunts back as you settle near the fire, the smell of burned beans still clinging to your clothes. Your stomach finally quiets. For now. Tomorrow, same routine, same beans, same mystery meat. You better get used to it. And during Lent once, the priest smelled it in the air and demanded a public apology and the leftovers. Not even the dog got a bite. Bear your growing belly like armor and a target, all at once. Right here is the Viking version of a claim slip. The sun's finally starting to roast your neck, and your saddle's groaning under you like it's just as tired of your butt as you are. You squint into the horizon. Nothing but flat land, the occasional clump of brush, and a cloud of dust kicked up by the cattle. Somewhere behind you, someone is cursing at a wayward steer, and all the while, that hat on your head? It's doing. Let's talk about the cowboy hat. It's iconic, sure, wide brim, high crown, maybe with a little curve if you're feeling fancy. But out here, that hat is more than fashion. It's survival gear. You don't just wear it, you rely on it. Just in case. For days. You're expected to be the one. First off, the shade. That broad brim isn't there to make you look like a spaghetti western extra. It's there to keep your ears from crisping like bacon under the sun. The western sun is no joke, especially in places like New Mexico or West Texas, where there's nothing between you and the sky but regret. Your hat creates a moving patch of need to wave someone down from across the prairie? Use your hat. Need to fan the fire because Cookie's beans are stubborn? Hat. Need to swat a scorpion away from your boot or gently encourage a sleeping cow to keep walking? Yep, hat again. One cowboy reportedly killed a rattlesnake using only his hat and an extremely colorful scream. Historians still argue whether that actually happened, and it doesn't stop there. At night, when you bed down under the stars, guess what becomes your pillow? That same hat, tucked under your head, or folded inside your saddle blanket. You hold on to it like a security blanket you never realized you'd need. You take care of your hat. It's not just an accessory, it's your daily companion. If it blows off in the wind, you chase it. If it gets too wet, you dry it carefully by the fire. Lose it, and you're not just sunburned. You're socially branded. A cowboy without a hat is like a cactus without spikes. Weird and very, very exposed. Different hats had different shapes depending on region and practicality. The Mexican vaquero style had a flat crown and wider brim. Northern cowboys leaned toward taller crowns that trapped warm air on cold mornings. Some added decorations, a feather, a card, a leather band. Others stitched hidden pockets inside the lining to store small valuables, like silver coins or, oddly enough, dried fruit. And yes, sometimes they hid letters in their hats. One cowboy in 1871 was found with a folded note in his hat band. It was a goodbye letter to a woman named Clara. Never sent, maybe never even read. Bit of frontier romance for you, right there. Then, because, well, hygiene, then there's rain. That's quirkier use. Some cowboys played cards using their hat as the table. You flip it upside down in your lap, deal into it, and no breeze in the world will scatter your hand. Of course, if you're losing badly, that hat might also get thrown into the fire, stomped on, or used as an impromptu swear jar. flooded nearby homes and shops and even drowned a few unlucky souls caught in the deluge. Despite, you start to appreciate just how much gear has to multitask out here. A bandana becomes a dust mask, a tourniquet, a pot holder. A saddle becomes... Historians still debate the origin of the classic cowboy hat design. Some say it evolved from the Mexican sombrero. Others argue it was the brainchild of hat maker John B. Stetson, who supposedly crafted the first Boss of the Plains in the 1860s. What's agreed upon is that the style spread like wildfire, and not just in the West. Easterners started copying the look, hoping to catch a little rugged charm, even if the closest they got to cattle was a steakhouse. More about swagger. You tilt your hat against the sun, adjust the chin strap, and keep riding. A gust of wind hits hard, but your hat holds. Barely. You make a mental note. Add hat-saving reflexes to your growing list of cowboy skills, along with pretending this jerky doesn't taste like sadness, and navigating using only cow droppings and bad guesses. Later, as dusk settles in, and Cookie starts rattling pots again, you take your hat off and gently dust it out. The inside is damp with sweat, but it's held up. One more day survived. One more day with the one thing that's had your back, top, sides, and everything in between. The hat might not be glamorous, but in this life, it's gold, Dot. It's dark again. The fire's low. The stars are back, and your belly's still digesting beans that may have been cooked in a boot. You stretch out under the night sky, the dust settling into your joints like you're made of rusty hinges. This is home for the night. A flat patch of dirt, a saddle for a pillow, and the occasional cow farting loudly in the dark. Ah, cowboy luxury. You're not sleeping in a bed. There's no mattress, no sheets, and definitely no mint on your pillow. Unless you count the wild mint that somehow ended up squashed under your hat. Tonight, like every night, you're sleeping on the ground. Maybe under the stars. Maybe under a blanket that hasn't been washed since Lincoln was president. Either way, it's going to be a bumpy, chilly ride to dreamland. Most cowboys slept with just a bedroll, usually a couple of thick wool blankets rolled up around a tarp. If you had a little more coin, or were lucky, you might carry what they called a sugan, which was basically the cowboy equivalent of a sleeping bag. Heavy, stiff, itchy as sin, and smelling faintly of feet. But it beat lying in the open with nothing but you don't get to pick where you sleep. The trail boss decides where the herd stops for the night, and you bed down near the cattle so you can respond if something spooks them, like thunder, wolves, or one particularly musical snorer in the group. The idea of privacy is a myth. You're sharing your space with noise is a given. The cows grunt and low through the night. The horses shuffle and sigh. Someone's always coughing. Someone else is probably sleep-talking about stew. And then there's the constant chirping of crickets, the occasional howl from a coyote, and once in a while, the not-so-gentle rustle of something bigger sniffing around the edge of camp. Imagine someone carving a counterboast. I was there, he tripped over a sheep. That sort of public debunking could haunt your name for years, because as we've said before, the Vikings were obsessed with reputation. It followed you, shaped your life, and, through sticks and songs, outlived you. Historians still argue whether cowboys preferred open-air sleeping because of habit, or simply because tents were too much hassle to carry. Tents were rare on trail drives. They took time to set up, added weight, and didn't really improve the quality of sleep when the floor was still dirt and your neighbors were still snoring cattle. Wonder how much easier life might be with respect instead of fear. Trusted allies. And cold? Cold was your constant enemy. Even in summer, the prairie could get chilly at night. You'd pull your hat down low, wrap your duster tight, and hope your blanket hadn't absorbed too much morning dew. In winter, sleeping outside meant a nightly gamble with frostbite. Cowboys sometimes slept in pairs, not for romance, but survival. Shared body heat was you wake up to birdsong and the faint echo of someone yelling at a goat. Another blessed day in God's muddiest kingdom. You stretch, yawn. You've begun to notice something odd about this system. You work the fields sunup to sundown. You till the land, plant the seeds, pray for rain, and sometimes even get rain that isn't acidic or possessed. You weed, harvest, bundle, and store. All of it with your own calloused hands. And yet when it's time to divide the fruits of your labor, suddenly the church owns a third of your hellfire economics, as it turns out, is a real thing. You're constantly being told that poverty is holy, but somehow it's always your poverty they're talking about. The bishop owns 3 manors. Mainstream historical fact. By the late Middle Ages, the church wasn't just a spiritual force. It was a full-blown economic machine. It ran mills, leased land, operated markets. Here's the best part. Some priests had side hustles. They rented out land, invested in vineyards, and charged for blessings like it was a divine vending machine. Want to get married? That'll cost you. Want your field? You start to realize that the church plays the long game. They control life and death. They own the land under your feet and the invisible moral scoreboard hovering above your soul. The local lord might beat you or tax you, but the church can excommunicate you. That's social death. If the priest says you're out, you're out. No trades, no refunds. Old Marta, down the lane, once refused to pay her church dues. She said she gave what she could, and that should be enough. Within a month, her grandson got a weird fever. Her roof caught fire, and her dog ran away. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe Brother Alric just really wanted those chickens she'd been holding back. Birth. Historians still argue whether the peasantry truly feared excommunication or just feared what it represented. Total isolation. Without the church's blessing, you couldn't marry, trade, bury, or even share bread with your neighbors. You became a spiritual pariah. And in a small village where everyone knows who borrowed whose shovel, that matters. It's your brand recognition. So, what do? You adapt. You become fluent in churchese. When asked how your crops are doing, you say, as God allows. When your cow dies, you say, a trial from heaven. When your neighbor asks if you're angry about tithes, you lower your voice and say, better to suffer now than later. And then you wink, against rock, because behind all the sermons and relics, there's a quiet understanding among peasants. The church is powerful, yes, but it's also full of holes. Loopholes, that is. Like pretending to donate your field, but still working it in secret. Or baptizing your piglet for a better sale at market. Or accidentally feeding the priest's sermon notes to your goat. Ruthless politics of the time. a kind of Viking franchise, if you will. There's even evidence that warriors custom-ordered blades with these identifiers. It wasn't vanity, it was security. If the blade was stolen, the mark could help recover it. If it broke in battle, the mark helped assign blame or praise. And if it was passed on, that mark made it more than a tool. It made it a legacy. But the church isn't stupid. They know peasants bend rules. That's why they invented guilt. Not just the feeling, but a whole system. You're not just punished for what you do. You're punished for what you think. Thought about skipping Mass? Sin. Laughed during a funeral? Sin. Wondered you walk a fine line. On one side, obedience. On the other, survival. You want to keep your head down and your spirit up, but it's not easy when every sermon reminds you that your soul is basically on fire unless you do exactly as told. Into your walls at night like unwelcome goat, and sometimes the sermons get creative. Brother Alric once claimed that hell was like a banquet, except you're the meal. That one haunted your dreams for a week. Another time, he said that heaven was full of singing and bread with no crusts. That sounded nice, until he added that only truly generous tithe payers would get a seat. You could practically hear the coin purses creaking a quirky tidbit. There was once a village that believed burying coins under the church floor could buy faster entrance into heaven. The priest didn't correct them. He just quietly expanded the church floor. Every few months, some say he built a side chapel with that money. Others say he retired early and opened a brewery. You try not to think about it too hard. After all, your job isn't to ask questions. Your job is to plow, pray, pay, and perish. In that order. If you're lucky, someone will remember your name. Maybe even light a candle for your soul. That's worth something, right? Still, there are days when you look at the fields and wonder what it would be like if the church wasn't everywhere. If you could wake up without bells, work without prayers, think without fear. Then the wind shifts, and the church tower casts its long shadow across the barley, and you remember, the church is always watching Dot. So you bend your head, mumble a prayer, and keep walking. Sonnet, still sharp, still angry. It's late summer now, the season of... You've got a small stash hidden in the floorboards. That's how you survive, really. The church may own the truth, but you and your neighbors own the imagination. Relics are the hottest black market item around. People will trade bread, ale, even blessing coupons for a decent relic, especially during lean times when the line between superstition and salvation starts to blur. Or fall under the sway of other courtiers. Your daughters may be married off. Mainstream historical fact. By the Middle Ages, the relic trade had become a massive enterprise. Churches competed to claim possession of saintly bones, pieces of the true cross, or vials of holy tears. Some of them were likely real, most probably not. One infamous case included 3 separate heads of John the Baptist, all displayed in different regions. These writings challenge the stereotype of the but you don't need a cathedral to play the game. In fact, the smaller the village, the easier it is to slide a fake into circulation. A friend of yours once claimed his dog coughed up a splinter from the manger of baby Jesus. He charged 2 eggs for a peek and had, it's all a little bit ridiculous, but it's also kind of beautiful. These strange little tokens, feathers, bones, beads, fabric scraps, carry hope. and that's not nothing. When you're stuck working someone else's land for a church that's richer than the king, sometimes hope is the only thing you can afford. Century, but it might be more bizarre than you think. It is as much about survival, and the church doesn't always crack down. In fact, some priests encourage this stuff. Not the outright fraud, but the little local superstitions that bring people into the churchyard. If someone believes a sacred bell can heal a toothache, and they're more likely to come to Mass because of it, well, what's the harm? Is emptied. Explorer Percy Fawcett famously disappeared, trying to... Still, there's a line. You've seen what happens when someone takes it too far. Last spring, a woman named Iselda started claiming she could heal people with a blessed turnip. For a few weeks, she was a hit, blessing chickens, curing headaches, making people think they'd seen visions. Then Brother Aldrich caught wind. 2 days later, she was encouraged to confess and stop competing with the church's teachings. The turnip, historians still argue whether the church genuinely feared peasant spirituality or simply wanted to maintain monopoly control over hope. Some say the clergy tolerated local customs so long as they didn't undercut authority. Others believe anything that smacked of paganism or unauthorized miracles was quickly squashed. But you like to imagine there's some truth to it. Swallowed by time and nature. You walk this tightrope every day, believing, but not too much. Trusting, but not loudly. Creating little rituals of your own when no one's watching. Like kissing the doorframe 3 times before leaving, or whispering the names of dead relatives into your stew for flavor. It's all superstition, of course, but it's yours. It's a lecture about Eve, and then there are the saints. So many saints. More than you can name, and certainly more than your priest can keep straight. Saint Elmo protects sailors. Saint Apollonia guards your teeth. Saint Fiacre watches over gardeners, hemorrhoid, and when something does go wrong, a sick child, a failing harvest, a bad dream, you turn to the church and the saints and that weird rock you found in the woods. Because why not? In this life, you cover all your bases: prayer, relics, a pinch of salt over your left shoulder. Wine or couches at dinner, but they are sharing water. Occasionally, unfortunately, at the same time. And preserved only by luck and moisture. You even try a side hustle once, selling tiny bottles of holy dew collected from the chapel's windowsill. You say it only forms on St. Agnes's feast day and can cure rashes. It smells like mildew and shame, but people pay in bread and buttons. You make a decent haul, and still, you feel a thrill every time someone believes in your relic. Not just because of the trade value, but because in that moment, you have power. You're the one offering comfort, mystery, maybe even salvation. For a second, the system bends toward you, quirky tidbit. Some peasants believed that carrying a piece of a church's thatch in your boot would make you walk farther without tiring. Another said that swallowing a pinch of altar dust before a journey would ensure safe travels, assuming you didn't choke on it first. There's even talk of a man who buried a communion wafer in his field to bless his crops. The priest called it sacrilege, his wheat, so tonight, after a long day of bartering and bluffing, you sit beside your small fire, rolling the toe-bone rock between your fingers. You're not sure if it's sacred, haunted, or just a nice rock, but as the wind howls outside and the candles flicker low, you whisper, "The harvest is almost here." You can feel it in the air, the mix of heat, dust, and the slight hint of something you can't name. It's not just the promise of a full pantry, but something deeper. The whole village is gearing up. Families are running around like ants in a frantic, pre-winter frenzy, cleaning, tying bundles of straw, sharpening tools. The abbey is no different. The priests are all wearing their best tunics, combing their hair, polishing their shoes, like they're preparing for something more than just a couple of good harvest prayers. You've seen it before. The church's harvest celebration, but you don't mind really. Well, not too much. It's a time of year when everyone's a little bit in love with the idea of food and good fortune. The thing is, you're smart enough to know that this celebration isn't really for the peasants. It's for and yet, despite all that, there's a strange camaraderie during these harvest festivals. Everyone's worked so hard all year. This is one of the rare moments where the line between peasant and priest blurs. Everyone gathers together, sharing songs and stories, sometimes laughing in a way that feels like a genuine reprieve. If the priest tells a joke, even mainstream historical fact. The church's control over food production during the Middle Ages was so extensive that in some places it was said that peasants would sometimes have more respect for the local abbey's harvest manager than their own lord. The abbey was essentially the middleman between you and your crops. They often ensured crops were blessed before harvest. So the idea of a church feast taught you run your fingers across a seal pressed into hardened wax. The symbol, a snake eating its tail, sits in the center, flanked by 2 runes. It's part brand, part vow. Whoever receives this knows who sent it and what's expected. The wax crumbles slightly as you touch it. Fragile but effective, and certainly easier to carry than a sheep. But then the feast ends. And as always, once the celebrations are over and the final hymn is sung, the sobering reality kicks in. The abbey takes its share, as always. Sometimes it's the best of the harvest. Sometimes it's a straight percentage, no matter the quality of your crop. And sometimes they just take You've heard stories, though. Rumors, in some cases, 2 matching tokens would be made. One for the owner, one for the trader. When brought back together, the 2 pieces would reunite, like a key and a lock, or 2 puzzle halves. It's the Viking equivalent of a claim check. You don't get your goods unless your token matches the one hanging in storage. Still, no matter how you work around it, the idea that the church could demand a percentage of your harvest, and the idea that no one questions it, still stings. This year, like every other, the priests will drive up in their cart, pretending to be pious, ready to accept whatever you have left, like their generosity is a grace to you. You wonder if they even remember the worst part? The guilt. Because at some point, the church's hold isn't just in what it takes. It's in how it makes you feel about what it gave. You've heard the priests talk about giving from your heart, about generosity being a path to salvation. And deep down, you know it's all a system designed to make you feel great. Quirky tidbit. There was actually a harvest tax imposed by the church on grain that wasn't shared at the feast. If you didn't show up with your designated tithe share, there were special fines, like having to work in the abbey garden or giving the church first dibs on your best cheese. It was like a bad, unfunny joke no one ever asked to hear, from a slightly grumpy sheep. But for now, you simply move forward. The harvest isn't done yet, and there's plenty of time to barter, beg, or fake your way out of a little extra tithing. Maybe you'll slip by this year. Maybe the church will overlook your mildly suspicious goat milk production. Maybe you'll even get away, but maybe, just maybe, it won't matter. Because even as you hoard that last bit of barley and mutter prayers to the saints of luck and mischief, you know the truth. The system is built to survive. The days are shortening, the air growing colder, and with it, a quiet tension begins to settle over the village. The harvest is, but it's not just about surviving the cold. It's about surviving the church's ongoing grip over your life, even as the rest of the world slows down. Because when the weather turns, so does the rhythm of life in your village. The church takes on an even more central role during these months. It's not just a place of worship. There's a cold irony to it all. As your hands stiffen from the chill, you find yourself more and more at the mercy of your priests. Their sermons about charity, grace, and heavenly rewards seem to echo louder in the winter when the firelight flickers weakly and the darkness stretches longer than you ever remember. During these months, but the feasts aren't for you. Mainstream historical fact. The winter months, especially around the feast, but, of course, you can't complain. That would be a sure way to get yourself some unwanted attention. And, anyway, you're too cold, too tired, and too busy trying to scrape by. You walk past one and trace your fingers over the runes. They read, Debt owed by Torkel. 2 hides of wool. Pay before the full moon. Below it is a triangle, the mark of the local trade council. Simple, direct, and definitely public. But even as the church exerts its dominance, you notice something else happening. Something subtle. You're not alone in your thoughts. You begin to hear murmurs of discontent among your fellow villagers. It starts small, nothing overt, just a whispered comment here and there, a grumble when the tithing collection plate is passed. You hear an old woman named Maeve. Historians still argue whether such dissatisfaction was widespread or if it was just the occasional venting of weary peasants. Some historians believe that the church's monopoly on power was so entrenched that any real resistance, open or not, was simply impossible. Others suggest that small acts of rebellion, it's a dangerous thing to speak ill of the church, though. But for now, at least, there's no immediate consequence. People still share their food, still lend a hand when needed. It's not like they don't understand each other's struggle. At least in the village, there's that unspoken solidarity. For a moment, it feels like a kind of quiet resistance, one that doesn't shout or rebel, but simply exists in the spaces between the rituals, or openly hostile. Some queens formed. You find yourself wondering whether this slow, steady buildup of quiet dissatisfaction will lead to anything. The church may have the official word of God, but you can feel it in your bones. The truth that keeps slipping out of the cracks in your small village. The truth that doesn't come from sermons or saints. It's the understanding that you're part of something bigger than yourself. And for now, though, you can only keep your head down, share your fire, and hope that this winter is like the others. A long, dark season of struggle that eventually gives way to the sun. Because if there's one thing you know for sure, it's that life will keep going. You'll keep surviving. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find a way to thrive. Quirky tidbit. Some peasants used to celebrate the Feast of Fools around this time, a day when the roles of master and servant were reversed. The serfs would mock their lords, the priests, and even the king if they could. It was a moment of winter settles in, and it's harder now to distinguish the day from the night. The sun barely peeks over the horizon before slipping behind the thick, endless clouds. The ground is frozen, the earth too stiff to work, and you're left to wait. To huddle inside with your family, your fellow villagers, and the strange warmth that comes from the kind of togetherness this time of year is strange. Still, you go to Mass, you attend the prayers, mostly because there's nothing else to do. It's not like you're going to see the sun anytime soon. You can't quite bring yourself to let go of the rituals. After all, it's what you've known all your life. It's what's kept your family safe for generations, even if it never quite fills your stomach. It's in cruel games. Own risk. The priests, of course, are in their element. The candles are always lit, the incense heavy in the air, and the cold stone of the chapel feels oddly comforting in its own way. You've heard whispers among the villagers that some of the priests are indulging in a bit too much wine. There's been talk about Father Armand's extra generous portions at dinner, and the way he's been sneaking away from the altar for longer than usual during the evening Mass. You think about it for a moment, then shrug it off. Mainstream historical fact. The winter months were not just a time for reflection and prayer, they were also a time for heavy feasts and wine, especially among the clergy. But you don't concern yourself with the excesses of others. Your focus is on surviving. You've learned one thing you've come to realize in these long, dark months. Still, it's hard not to see how the church operates, how it weaves its own web of control. The feasts and the prayers might offer comfort, but they're also ways to remind you of what you don't have. You can't afford to make your own decisions about your life. You can only hope that your offerings and prayers are enough to appease a higher power. The Church's authority doesn't. Historians still argue whether the Church's ability to shape daily life in such intimate ways was the result of a calculated move for power, or whether it was a natural consequence of religion's deep entwinement with every aspect of medieval society. What is clear is that, over time, the Church became more than just. The more you think about it, the more you begin to see the small ways. But even as the priests make their rounds, collecting tithes and offerings, you find solace in the small rebellions, the whispered jokes between friends, the way people quietly share food without the Church knowing. You know it's not much, it's small, maybe even insignificant. But in these moments, you feel like something quirky tidbit. One of the more obscure medieval customs you've heard about is the practice of fasting for luck. Some people, believing that their good fortune was directly tied to spiritual discipline, would spend the day in church, refraining from food and drink entirely, not to gain favor with God, but to ensure that luck would turn in their favor in the coming months. Sometimes their luck came in the form of an unexpectedly good harvest. Other times, you look around, taking in the sight of the sleepy village, the smoke rising from chimneys, the occasional laugh from the common room of the tavern. Things may be hard, and the Church's grip may be tight, but there's something in the air, a strange energy, a hope, maybe. A quiet winter drags on, each day indistinguishable from the last, like the repetitive litany of prayers you hear during Mass. Your breath hangs in the air inside the small hut, the fire barely enough to stave off the cold. You've stopped counting the days. It doesn't really matter anymore. Time has taken on a different shape. The Church, however, doesn't stop. The priests keep their duties. The bells toll at the usual hours, and the rituals march on. The Masses still fill the small chapel, even though fewer people attend these days. What's the point of attending Mass when there's nothing left to give? What's the point of offering prayers when they've all started to feel hollow, The thought crosses your mind, and yet, there's a certain comfort in the rituals, isn't there? When everything else feels out of your control, the church's calendar gives you something solid to cling to. There's the Feast of St. Nicholas in early December, the solemn masses of Advent, the anticipation of Christmas. For all the church's power, its ability to, but there's a deeper feeling beneath all this. A feeling that you've come to understand over the years, especially when the snow starts falling and the cold really settles in. The church isn't just about faith, it's about control. The priests may give blessings and assurances, but in the end, they own time. And they make sure you never forget it. Their schedules are yours to follow. Historians, there are whispers, though, and you can't help but listen. There's talk of a silent rebellion, of people questioning the church's right to claim the harvest, to claim your tithe, to claim your labor. You hear bits and pieces as you walk through the village. It's not loud or overt, but it's there. One of the younger villagers, a woman named Alina, speaks often of the power of the land. She says the harvest is God's gift to the people, not to the priests. She claims that the church is only in it for the grain and the gold, and that you and your fellow villagers should be able to keep what you grow. You listen carefully when she speaks. Some of what she, in the dead of winter, with little to occupy your time besides the long, cold hours by the fire, these thoughts start to grow. You begin to wonder whether the church is really necessary for survival. After all, you've been making do without them for ages. You've managed to survive the season. It's hard to say. After all, the church provides a kind of community. It's a place where people gather in the dead of winter to sing hymns, to share in the warmth, to be reminded that they're not alone. The masses may be about the priest's power, but the people still get something out of it. And there's a strange kind of safety in knowing you're all in it. But you can't deny that there's a deep, gnawing feeling that the church, despite all its comfort and tradition, has too much control over your life. It decides when you pray, how you pray, when you eat, how you eat. You begin to feel like a cog in a much larger machine. A machine built not to help you survive, but to make sure you never forget. You pass one final ship tied at the far end of the harbor. It's older, battered, its carvings faded but still visible. A swirl of ravens, half effaced, spirals down the prow. Beneath them, just barely etched into the wood, is a personal rune. You recognize it from earlier, on a fish barrel, on a trade token, on a post by the market. That symbol follows its owner everywhere, even onto the sea. But it doesn't matter what Alina says or what you hear in hushed whispers by the fire. The first hints of spring creep in as the days stretch longer, the sun's warmth slipping through the cracks in the clouds. The snow begins to melt, the once frozen earth loosening its grip. For you, spring is a mix of anticipation and trepidation. The world is waking up, but so is the pressure to once again serve the rhythm. You're out in the fields. When the thaw finally starts, the church, you realize, doesn't care much about the seasons or the cycles of nature. It only cares about its own. It's constantly reminding you that no matter how hard you work, the labor of your hands doesn't truly belong to you. It belongs to God, and God's representative on earth. Mainstream historical fact. The medieval tithe was a substantial part of the church's wealth and influence. Typically, peasants were required to give 10% of their produce to the church, a percentage that could be difficult to meet, especially in years of poor harvests. This system was often you're out there in the fields, the breeze picking up, and the scent of fresh earth rising around you. But the thought of the upcoming tithe looms heavy. But you can't change anything. Not now, anyway. You've learned to work within the system to make do. That's what the church has trained you to do. To obey, to bend, to offer. You've lived with its shadow your entire life. Even as your hands grow calloused again, even as the soil seems to respond to your touch with new life, and yet, there's something about spring that makes you feel like there might be a way out. Maybe it's the warmth in the air, the hope that the season brings. Maybe it's because you've been through so many cycles of hardship and survival that you've started to see. You think of Alina again, the woman who speaks about the land as if it's its own living, breathing thing. You think of her words, the ones she whispers when no one else is listening. The harvest is ours, not theirs. It's an unsettling thought, but a thought that feels right. Did the punchline. Profound ways. Some stones were placed along roads, others at crossroads or near harbors, ensuring maximum visibility. You didn't raise a stone in the forest. You raised it where people would pass by, pause, and read, sometimes aloud. The stone spoke long after your voice was gone. In these moments of quiet rebellion, you realize that perhaps Alina's thoughts aren't so crazy after all. There's power in the land, in the labor you and your fellow villagers put into it. Maybe it's not enough to throw off the church's grip completely, but maybe, just maybe, it's enough to carve out a little space for yourself. It's a risky thought, dangerous even, but you walk past another. This one reads, Thorgerd raised this stone for herself while she was alive. She has property in 3 valleys and owns the ship Fairwind. It's pure Viking flex, quirky tidbit. In some rural communities, there was a tradition of offering up a first fruits sacrifice to the church at the beginning of the harvest season. This wasn't just a sign of respect for God, it was also a way to appease the local priest and ensure that your crops would be blessed. Some peasants would go so far as to bring but you've had enough of offerings for now. For the first time in a long while, you let your hands sink deep into the soil, and you feel, just for a moment, the power of what you've worked so hard to cultivate. Maybe this season things will change. Maybe they won't. But for now, you're here, and you're part of the land. The days continue to stretch on, the sun edging higher, and the earth starts to soften underfoot. The seeds you've planted are still too young to bear fruit, but already you can feel the shift. It's subtle, but even as the earth turns beneath you, you can't shake the feeling that things are moving in a direction you don't entirely control. The church's presence, like an uninvited guest, seems to be everywhere. The bells ring on schedule, the priests make their rounds, and the expectations grow ever greater as the days lengthen. Spring isn't just about new growth. There's a small part of you that wonders what it would be like. Mainstream historical fact. The medieval church had a hand in almost every aspect of daily life, from the crops in the field to the festivals in the village square. It wasn't just a religious institution. It was the social and economic backbone of society. The church decided when you celebrated, when you fasted, and even when you worked. In fact, as the weeks move forward, the church's ever-watchful eye falls on you again. The priests come around more frequently now, ensuring that the crops are blessed, that the harvest will be plentiful. They're quick to remind you that the reason your fields are fertile is due to divine grace, that Any bounty you reap is a direct result of the blessings they bestow. And yet, you can't shake the feeling that there's something off. You think about Alina's. Historians still argue about how many medieval peasants quietly chafed against the church's influence. Some scholars suggest that peasant uprisings were more common than previously believed, often beginning with subtle forms of resistance, like withholding taxes or ignoring certain church-imposed rituals. Others believe that the constant cycle of labor and obligation led to an internalized sense. In the meantime, you continue with you lean in, realization dawning. This isn't just a story. This is a shout-out, a name drop that, in Viking society, carried more weight than any written review or carved token. If your deeds made it into a saga, especially while you were still alive, you weren't just respected. You were immortalized. Vikings didn't just tell stories to entertain. They told stories to remember. And being remembered meant power. It meant your reputation could travel without you. It meant you had influence, what today might be called brand recognition, or, more bluntly, viral marketing. As you work the land, the sun now warming your skin, you can't help but wonder what it might feel like to be free of all this, free of the church's reach, free of the endless cycle. But, as you see the priests approaching, their habits fluttering in the spring breeze, you know that thought will have to wait. For now, you have your work, and that's all that really matters. The seasons turn as they all. It's harvest time. You've worked the fields for months, toiling under the hot sun, the sweat running down your face, but it's always the same at the end. No matter how much you manage to gather, the priest will come. The tithe will be taken. It's the price for your survival, the price for the blessings of a good harvest. And just like every other year, it's hard to escape the feat, but this year feels different. The crops are better than you expected. Maybe it's the rain, maybe it's the soil, maybe it's just the sheer determination in your hands. For the first time in a long while, you think you might actually have enough to keep for yourself, to feed your family, to store away for the coming winter. You've seen enough lean years to know that there's no guarantee the day the priest comes to take his tithe, you're waiting for him. You've gathered everything in neat, tidy piles, corn, wheat, a few chickens. It's more than usual, but you can't help the slight swell of pride in your chest. Mainstream historical fact. The tithe was often a significant portion of a peasant's harvest, and it wasn't always a pleasant exchange. Many peasants resented the church's demand, especially when harvests were poor. In some cases, the church would even require you nod and pretend this is normal. It might be. You're in Rome, where yesterday someone tried to sell you fermented garlic as a full-body rebalance. Someone sneezes behind you. Loud, wet, close. You don't run, but your walking speed increases significantly. You step into the cool corridor near the exit. A gentle breeze slips through a carved vent. You breathe deeply. It smells like fresh plaster, thyme, and minor regret. This is the moment where bathers reflect. You've gone through the ritual, soaked, scraped, perfumed, gossip splattered, and now mildly inflamed, but cleaner. Probably, spiritually at least. And here's the real truth. Romans didn't expect, still, some got clever. There were oils laced with herbs to fight infections, towels boiled in vinegar, and certain wealthy bathers brought their own strigils, sometimes gold with inscriptions like, "Do not share." One general allegedly had his slaves burn any towel that touched his armpits. You feel seen. You notice a few people as you gather your things, a drying cloth, a sandal that might be yours, and your remaining dignity. You catch your reflection in a polished bronze disc hung like a mirror. You look, well, rosy, alert, slightly shinier than usual. Here's a quirky little fact. Some Viking-era pendants and brooches include tiny rune carvings that reference lines from popular sagas. Like wearing your favorite quote from a Netflix show, but in metal. Some were even arranged so you'd have to know the story to get the meaning. A secret handshake in wearable form. The bard ends his tale with a flourish. Voice rising, eyes sweeping the room. He names the sponsor again, then nods once toward the back of the hall. A man there lifts his cup, half smiling. Not modest, just aware. He's been seen, he's been heard, and now everyone else knows it. In the Viking world, reputation was more than identity. It was currency. And if carved marks were the receipts, sagas were the testimonials. Long before Yelp, 5-star ratings, or Twitter threads, the Vikings had already perfected the art of being known, and they didn't even need Wi-Fi. You stand at the edge of a bustling riverside market, the kind that springs up like mushrooms wherever trade routes tangle. All around you, goods shift hands. Furs for honey, glass beads for dried fish, combs for copper. But what fascinates you there isn't the trade itself. It's what comes after. A merchant finishes wrapping up a bundle of woven cloth, then presses a small heated seal into the edge of the package. The wax cools quickly, hardens, and now, like a cherry on top, his personal mark is stamped right into it. A boar's head inside a circle. Not fancy, but unmistakable. You've just witnessed an early form of branding, not in the corporate sense, but in the Viking sense. A personal signature, unique to its owner, applied not with a pen, but with heat, pressure, and pride. And it's not limited to wax. Nearby, another trader uses a wood-burning tool to press the same symbol into a shipping crate. His apprentice watches carefully. It has to be just right. Slightly off, and it's a fraud. Or worse, an embarrassment. These marks were vital for Viking merchants traveling across vast regions, from Norway to the Baltics, from Ireland to the Black Sea. A consistent, recognizable mark meant trust. It told distant buyers, this fur comes from Bjorn of the West Fjords, or this mead is guaranteed by Solveig of Hedeby. Historians still argue how standardized these marks really were. Some think they were deeply personal, passed down from generation to generation, evolving slowly like a family crest. Others suggest they were more improvisational, often drawn from local motifs, gods, or nature. Either way, they worked. Imagine being a buyer in a foreign port. You don't speak the merchant's language, you don't know their customs, but you recognize that carved spiral from the crate you saw 2 summers ago, the one that held perfect amber beads. So you nod, gesture for the crate, and pay a little more than you might have otherwise, because you trust the mark. And this wasn't just for locals. Viking traders moving through Slavic lands, the Frankish coast, or even Arabic regions relied on visual identity. They didn't always carry letters of reference or scrolls of introduction. They carried goods that spoke for them. There's a quirky archaeological find from eastern Sweden, a small wooden comb with 3 different merchant marks carved into it. Scholars believe it changed hands multiple times across its journey. each trader adding their symbol like a stamp on a passport. A living receipt, a timeline in wood. You pass another merchant who dips a soft red wax plug into a jar, then presses his seal into it. The smell is sharp. Berries, vinegar, something fermented. The wax hardens around the neck of the jar, sealing both the contents and the identity of the sender. If it arrives intact, it means the product is untouched. If broken, someone's in trouble. These marks, monograms, runes, pictograms, appear not just on trade goods but also on letters, cloth bolts, ceramic vessels, and even livestock. Yes, branding in the literal sense. Viking herders used heated iron tools to mark goats and cattle, each with a distinct symbol. Some families even branded their fishing nets or oars. If it could be stolen, it could be marked. And it wasn't just about theft, it was about value. A buyer didn't just want any cloak. They wanted a cloak from that weaver. The one whose mark was the twin ravens in a circle. The mark that meant the wool didn't shrink when wet. The mark that made you feel like someone had said your name in a saga. Over time, these merchant symbols began to travel independently. A mark spotted in Hedeby might appear years later on the Black Sea coast. Not always by the same hand, but by someone who'd adopted it. Imitation? Theft? Franchise? Historians still debate. Some suggest these traveling marks became more than brands. They became currencies. You could trade based on reputation alone. A crate stamped with a respected seal could command higher prices even if the merchant wasn't present. That's trust turned into economic leverage. A fringe theory proposes that some marks were even magical. Certain symbols recur across unrelated regions, always associated with successful trades or protection charms. Maybe coincidence. Maybe the ancient Norse version of a lucky logo. And here's the wildest thought. In a world without centralized governments, formal banking, or ID cards, these symbols were identity. You didn't need papers. You needed proof. And the cleanest proof of all? A simple, clear, well-known mark burned into wood or pressed into wax. You watch a boy tie a small cloth pouch shut, then seal it with a lump of beeswax. He presses a stamp into the wax, a sunburst with a cross in the center, and nods proudly at his father. It's the family mark. His mark now, too. And with that, the package becomes more than just goods. It becomes a message. It says, "This came from me. This is who I am." The artisan's hut smells of linseed oil, wood shavings, and pride. You step inside quietly, the floor creaking beneath your feet, and take in the rows of bowls, spoons, and carved cups neatly arranged on low wooden shelves. Each one looks ordinary at first, but as you pick up a bowl and tilt it toward the light, you spot it. A tiny mark, tucked discreetly into the underside. A swirl, a crescent, a pair of crossed lines. You've found the maker's mark. Vikings weren't just warriors and traders. They were makers. And, like any maker worth their salt, or iron filings, they wanted credit for their work. So, nestled in the shadowy undersides of everyday objects, they carved symbols that said, "This was mine. I made this." These weren't grand signatures. They weren't decorative flourishes. They were subtle, deliberate, and meant to last. The idea was simple. If someone held your bowl and liked how it felt, how it sat in their palm, how it didn't leak when filled with ale, Well, they might flip it over, find your mark, and look for it again. It's the Viking version of customer retention. Historians still argue whether these marks were standardized within guilds, if we can even call them that, or passed down within families. In many cases, the marks appear to be personal, unique to one craftsman, not a workshop. But in others, they're echoed across items found hundreds of miles apart, suggesting either apprenticeship chains or traveling artisans spreading their name with every spoon. One fringe find, a series of combs found buried in Dublin, all bear the same fishbone pattern on the base, likely a shared symbol of a single craft line. It might have even acted as a form of trademark, letting buyers in distant ports recognize quality goods from a specific coastal village in Norway. It's a brand, but without the packaging. You turn a small wooden cup in your hand and notice another interesting detail. The mark isn't carved, it's burned. A hot iron pin pressed against the base, searing the symbol in place. It's faster than carving, harder to fake, and, frankly, more dramatic. Vikings weren't shy about leaving their fingerprint on the world. But what's most fascinating is where the marks are hidden. Rarely are they front and center. They're under the lip of a spoon, inside the rim of a box lid, on the base of a handle. There's an intimacy to it, like the maker is whispering, "If you like it, find me." Some items bear multiple marks. A blacksmith's rune beside a woodcarver's symbol, for example. Proof of collaboration. That's not just branding. That's transparency. The consumer knew who did what. Modern corporate supply chains could learn a thing or two. You lift a polished plate and find a small triangle surrounded by dots. Simple but distinct. It matches a mark you saw earlier on a spinning spindle. Same family, same village. You start to piece together an invisible network. A world of craftsmen who spoke through symbols instead of invoices. And this wasn't limited to wood. Viking metalwork, especially jewelry, was full of discrete markings. A brooch might hide its mark beneath the pin catch. A cloak clasp might include a pattern so small you'd miss it unless you were looking. But once you knew it, you saw it everywhere. A quirky example comes from a grave in Gotland. A woman buried with a set of keys, each one bearing a different mark. Some historians suggest she was a household leader. Her keys unlocked goods, rooms, or trade chests, and each mark corresponded to a trusted craftsman. A literal key ring of reputational security. The trust these marks built was everything. If someone stole your design and tried to copy it, your reputation was your shield. If you carved well, made good tools, or wove clean lines, your symbol spread by word of mouth and by eye. But that also meant, if you messed up, the mark condemned you. There are stories, half remembered, half invented, of craftsmen changing their mark after a botched batch, of fleeing villages where a warped plate or weak clasp turned the tide of gossip against them, of starting fresh with a new symbol, hoping no one made the connection, because once your mark was known, it followed you. And people checked. You can almost picture a woman at a market flipping bowls like a detective, muttering, "Not this one, not this one." Ah, yes, here's the one with the mountain mark. I trust her bowls. In a way, it's humbling. All that work, all that carving and polishing, and your name, your legacy, is a thumb-sized notch tucked under the rim. But it was enough. The crowd murmurs and shifts around you. packed tight beneath an open sky. People are leaning on staffs, swatting flies, chewing dried fish, and waiting. You're at the thing. The Viking Public Assembly. It's half parliament, half county fair, and 100% drama. But today's not just about land disputes or inheritance quarrels. Today's about a mark. You can feel the tension already. A man, wide-shouldered, red-faced, is holding up a carved object for all to see. It's a seal, a token, a mark, and apparently a stolen one. "Ah, this is my symbol," he growls. "He carved it onto his ale barrels. He sold them under my name." A gasp, a few scattered chuckles. One person mutters something about watered-down ale. You inch forward. This isn't just a squabble over branding. It's a legal question. In a time before patents, copyright, or digital watermarks, who owns a symbol? Who gets to decide whether a mark has been stolen or earned? Historians still argue how formalized this kind of conflict resolution was. Viking law wasn't codified the way Roman law was, but it operated on precedent, memory, and reputation. If someone misused your mark, especially to sell goods, it wasn't just dishonest. It was fraud. And fraud, in a community built on reputation, was as serious as theft. The accused, a scrawnier man with twitchy eyes, holds up a different token. It looks similar, but not identical. "Mine has a twist at the end," he insists. "It's different." The crowd groans. Someone shouts, "That's like claiming you invented boats, but they're shaped slightly dumber." You stifle a laugh. This is where the Viking concept of legal branding emerges in full. Symbols weren't just decoration, they were protected social tools. Everyone here knows the consequences if they let imitations go unpunished. If a mark no longer guarantees quality, trust in the whole system cracks. And make no mistake, marks were watched. People at the thing remembered. They whispered when someone reused a famous rune. They spread news when a respected craftsman retired his symbol and handed it to his son. Marks lived and died in the social bloodstream of the village. One fringe case recorded in the Icelandic Gragas law code even references punishment for falsifying a trading token, a wooden stick bearing someone else's name and design. The accused had attempted to claim stored goods using a copied symbol. The punishment: public shaming and a fine of 3 ounces of silver. Not small potatoes. There's a deeper layer here. Vikings weren't bureaucrats. They didn't believe in forms, stamps, or triplicate receipts. But they did believe in consequences. If a person's mark was stolen, they had every right to demand restitution. And if the theft damaged their standing, especially in trade, it could spark feuds lasting generations. You watch the elder at the center of the crowd. Today's law speaker. Run his fingers over both tokens. He squints, tilts them, then asks one question. How many here have bought ale with this mark? A dozen hands rise. And how many with this one? 3, cautiously. Which tasted better? He adds, not missing a beat. The crowd erupts. Amid the laughter, something becomes clear. The mark isn't just about shape. It's about recognition. A symbol without reputation is just lines in wood. But a known mark, that's value. The elder rules in favor of the original mark holder. The counterfeit is to be burned, and the offender must repay 2 barrels worth of lost profit. It's justice, yes, but also a warning. don't mess with someone else's story. You turn away from the crowd and begin to notice more symbols everywhere. A man's cloak clasp bears a spiral you've seen carved into spear shafts. A woman's necklace pendant matches the mark you spotted on smoked fish crates. The marks aren't just legal claims. They're brands, in the oldest sense, burned into the social memory. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some merchants developed what we'd now call anti-forgery features. Complex symbols made of multiple strokes, carved in a specific sequence. Not just hard to copy, hard to fake well. There are even surviving sticks with tiny notch codes, hidden grooves that acted as internal authenticity checks, like a medieval QR code, but made of splinters. And for the truly elite, there was storytelling. The more famous the mark, the more often it appeared in sagas, gossip, or carved graffiti. And with that came protection. Try faking the Jarl's wolf claw symbol. You might as well steal his boots while you're at it. As the crowd disperses, the elder nods once toward you. A mark is a promise, he says. Make yours count, and just like that, you understand. Legal branding in the Viking world wasn't enforced by kings or courts. It was enforced by memory, by crowds, by jokes shouted in markets and raised eyebrows in mead halls. It was law, yes, but law woven into life. The wind's different today, gentler, warmer, as if even the sea has decided to rest. You're walking along the edge of the settlement now, past low fences and empty drying racks. The clamor of the markets, the clang of the forge, the droning voices of the thing all behind you. Out here, it's quiet, but your mind is full. You've followed marks and messages from sticks to stones, from sailcloth to combs, and everywhere in between. But now it's time to trace the last thread. How those carved Viking identities laid the groundwork for something strangely familiar. Business cards, trademarks, personal logos, everything from wax seals to email signatures has roots in this ancient, splintery legacy. The Vikings didn't invent paperwork. They didn't coin formal branding systems or legal bureaucracies. But they did create something enduring, a culture of presence, of visibility. They turned symbols into voices. They left pieces of themselves carved into wood, pressed into wax, etched into iron, and spun into wool. And slowly, without realizing it, they paved the road to something far more organized. You reach the edge of a wide clearing. Here, 3 tall runestones stand in a row. Each one bears the same mark in a different form. Once as a rune, once as a pictograph, and once as a full inscription. The same message. This is mine. I did this. I was here, spoken in 3 dialects of permanence. Historians still argue whether Viking branding directly influenced the merchant guilds of later centuries, but the evidence is suggestive. Many medieval European guilds adopted distinct marks, often passed from master to apprentice, exactly as Viking craftsmen had done with their makers' symbols. These marks were used on everything: cloth bolts, wine casks, barrels, armor. Trade routes expanded, and with them traveled not just goods, but reputations. One fringe theory suggests that even medieval merchant licenses, often decorated with stylized symbols, may have originated from Viking permission tokens and ring-based access systems. You carried proof of identity, not just for legality, but for trust. because trust, in a world of slow travel and inconsistent records, was the true currency. And it didn't stop in Europe. Some Norse merchant marks have been found as far as Russia, Byzantium, and even the Abbasid Caliphate. Traders carried their identity with them, on their seals, their ships, their tools. And those marks were recognized, copied, admired, sometimes stolen. That's the beginning of brand diffusion. A merchant from Trondheim shows up in Miklagard, Constantinople, and a year later, a similar spiral symbol appears on a Greek ceramic jug. Coincidence? Maybe. Maybe not. It's a long way from bark-carved flirtations to corporate logos, but the line is there, a mark, a message, a moment of self-declaration etched into something more permanent than breath. Here's a quiet little irony. By the time printed business cards became common in 17th century Europe, the world had almost forgotten that a Viking once did the same thing, with a scrap of wood and a crooked knife. No glossy finish, no LinkedIn link. Just identity, carved with care, and left behind to speak in his place. You sit down on a flat stone, running your fingers over the nearby runes. You've seen hundreds by now, on posts, tools, ships, shields, and still they hold your attention. Each one is a whisper from someone who refused to vanish quietly. Someone who said, "I made this," and meant it. That's the heart of the Viking business card. Not a sales pitch, not a gimmick. Just a mark left behind, enduring in a world that rarely gave anyone the luxury of permanence. Their system wasn't polished, but it was personal. It wasn't standardized, but it was trusted. It wasn't filed in a drawer, but it was remembered. And now, as the wind gently shifts the grass around the stones, as shadows grow long in the late sun, those marks remain, waiting, watching, speaking in their quiet, carved voices. Hey, I was here. So now, with the fire of history reduced to a soft ember, let's let everything slow down. You've wandered long roads tonight, roads made not of stone, but of stories, symbols, and carved promises. You've traced the weight of identity across bark and bone, across sails and swords, across the whispered trust of a name etched deep into something solid. And now all of it drifts into silence. The torches are out. The market is closed. The blacksmith's hammer lies still. The ships bob gently in the harbor, their dragon heads quiet beneath the moon. And in the distance, the last storyteller of the night finally runs out of words. The only sound left is the breeze through grass, and maybe the hush of waves licking the shore. You can breathe easier now. No one's carving. No one's watching. The world is at rest, and you've earned your place in it, tucked gently under the covers of time. Let the old marks fade from view for now. They'll be there in the morning, waiting patiently in the grain of the wood, the curl of the runes, the sigh of a forgotten name. Close your eyes. Let the world of blades and barrels, boasts and burned-in signatures drift away like a ship slipping over the edge of the world. You're safe here. You're remembered. You can rest.